Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about the Cold War. What is it, some of the key events, and more importantly, what was the point? So if this is something that you are interested in or studying for your exam, sit back, relax, and let's begin. Let's start with what is a Cold War? Well, a Cold War is actually the opposite of a hot war. A hot war occurs when two sides battle it out, physical, actual war. Whereas a Cold War is pretty much the opposite. It is a state of political tension and military competition between countries. It threatens to become a full war, but it never really does. So, to dumb it down very simply, it's like two kids at school threatening to beat each other up after school, and then nothing happens. That is pretty much what a Cold War is. And this Cold War was between the Soviet Union and the United States. Both believed that the world should be governed in different ways, and neither of which were willing to compromise in any kind of way. And so a Cold War in this context is pretty much just a competition spreading ideologies and beliefs between the Soviet Union and the United States. How did the Cold War begin? Well, it happened all the way back in 1917. In 1917, the world was still being ravaged by World War I. But we are particularly looking at what happened in Russia. Now, in Russia in 1917, people living in Russia were not very happy. The problem is that the Tsar, who was the leader of Russia, and the royal family were benefiting a lot from the money and spending money in ways that didn't benefit the poor. And so, not even the poor, just normal average people. And so in 1917, the Russian Revolution took place. The Russian Revolution was pretty much a whole bunch of normal people standing up and deciding that they no longer wanted to be ruled by the Tsar and his family, and just in general, didn't want to have a monarchy in any case. And so they decided that they wanted to find a way in which everyone was treated 100% equally. And what this actually became is what we know today as communism. Now, a lot of people hear the word communism and they say, ooh, that's a bad thing. We know that communism is bad. But when you look at it, communism is pretty much just wanting equality for everyone. The individual is not as important as the group. And so for people who had been suffering for such a long time, and with such a big deal of a difference between the wealthy and the not wealthy, communism seemed like a pretty good deal. And pretty much what this was is that communism is an economic system where trade and industry are owned by the government, and everything is shared equally amongst the people. So, for example, people working in a communist society, no matter what job they do, would still earn the same amount of money. On top of that, everything from factories, mines, electricity producers, etc., is all owned by the government. Any businesses belong to the government and nothing belonged to the people themselves. But the better the country was doing, the more everyone had, because it was being split equally. What we have today is capitalism, which is pretty much the opposite of communism. Capitalism is when people own the country's trade and industry. So things like our electricity producers can be people who own the business, right? If you want to start a bakery, the bakery is yours, and any profits that you make belong to you. In a communist society, the bakery would belong to the government, and you would just get a share of the profits of that business. And so basically the idea is that the Russians believed that if everyone was treated equally, then this wouldn't happen again. They would no longer be in such a state of poverty with the wealthy kings, queens, tsars, whatever, making a lot of money while the rest of them were sitting in absolute squander. But Why is this a problem? Why is it a problem if Russia wants to run its country the way that it wants to? Well, the problem is that they didn't just want it to be their country, they wanted to spread communism to everybody, and they did so by force. Normal average workers and people started the Red Army, and they started going around to different countries and forcing other countries to be a part of it. And they basically wanted the entire world to believe this communist agenda. The United States, on the other hand, was not happy about this. They liked capitalism, they thought capitalism was working really well, and so they wanted to find some ways in order to stop communism from spreading. And by doing so, they came up with 3 plans. Plan number 1 was the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine basically stated that the Americans would help any other country to resist communist takeover. So they would send things like money, resources, or even armies to help these little countries to stop communism taking over. Some examples of these are countries like Turkey and Greece, who very happily accepted America's offer and were never taken over by communists. The second plan was called the Marshall Plan, and this was going to help countries rebuild after World War I. Now, war causes a lot of damage, things like buildings, schools, hospitals, and in general, the economy of a country after a war is quite crazy. And so the Americans said that they would send money, resources, etc., to help countries rebuild. And the reason that they did this is because they wanted to show these countries that they didn't need communism in order to help rebuild. And finally, the last one was the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which we also call NATO. And NATO pretty much created a large joint military force in Europe, which meant that countries in Europe could join NATO and become part of a large combined military. And if something were to happen to your country, they would not only be fighting your country, they would also be fighting all the other countries that were part of NATO. And so all 3 of these plans were designed by the United States in order to not only slow down, but hopefully stop communism from spreading. Unfortunately, though, communism was still spreading, and soon an entire border lined up between Europe, causing everybody that lived on the east to be communist and everybody living on the west to be capitalist. And this border, which is not a real border, it's just a fake line that helps us to see the difference between communist and capitalist places. This border was called the Iron Curtain. So everything to the east of the Iron Curtain was communist, and everything west of the Iron Curtain was capitalist. And I feel like I should probably still tell you, it's not a real curtain. There's no iron. There's not like this massive metal wall that you'll come across. It's an ideological wall. It doesn't exist. Like the equator. It's not really a line. You can't see it. Next up, we have the arms race. Now, before we go any further, we're not talking about these arms. We're talking about arms as in firearms. We're talking guns, bombs, etc. Right? The arms race was pretty much a race to see which country could create the greatest and most powerful weapons. But here's the catch. It's a Cold War. No one's actually going to use them. So they spent a lot of time and a lot of money developing these deadly weapons that they never planned to use. But why? Why didn't they just use it, make it a hot war, and call it a day? Well, the problem is they were scared that they were mad. Mutually assured destruction. That's what MAD stands for. And pretty much the idea is that if one country were to set off an explosive weapon, the other country was going to fire back with the same, if not more, power. And so, because they were both so scared that they could attack at any time, neither of them did. And so, lots of crazy weapons were created during this time, including nuclear weapons, and we know how well that went in World War II. However, these weapons were never actually used because they were scared that if they used it, both countries would just stop existing. And while all of these different things were going on, at the same time, there was a space race. Now, the space race was a race to accomplish the most space-related achievements before the other. Up until this point, man hadn't really gone to space yet, and so the Americans and Russians decided to show their technological prowess by showing each other what they could do in space. Now, the space race is a bit of a controversial one because we don't actually know who won, but I'll leave that to you to decide. It all started off in 1957 when the Russians launched their first satellite into space called Sputnik 1. They also managed to send their first animal into space, which was Laika, the little Jack Russell. And that's a very sad story that I don't really feel like telling now, but look it up if you dare. Then in 1961, the Russians once again sent the first man into space, and this man's name was Yuri Gagarin. While he didn't land anywhere, he was the first person to orbit the Earth and come back down safely. Then in 1962, the Americans sent the first man, John Glenn, to do the same thing, orbit the Earth and come back down. 1963, the Russians sent Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman in space, and in 1965, the Russians again sent a man called Alexei Leonov to do the first spacewalk. So in other words, to exit the spacecraft and to walk alongside it. But in the year 1969, the Americans did the impossible. The Americans sent the first man, Neil Armstrong, to walk on the moon. Now, I'm not entirely sure if you're following with me, but the Russians did a lot of things first. But the Americans did the most important thing, which is putting a man on the moon. So the question is controversial. Did the Russians win because they did a lot of the things first? Or did the Americans win because they did the most important thing? Let me know what you think. Leave a comment down below. Did the Russians win or did the Americans win? What do you think? Now you must be thinking, well, this is rather dull. Why is it a war if there's no fighting happening? But let me tell you, there was definitely fighting happening. And this was through something called proxy wars. Proxy wars happen when two stronger countries use smaller countries to fight on their behalf. So in other words, instead of directly fighting each other, they would use smaller countries to battle it out. Some examples of proxy wars are things like in China, in Vietnam, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Korean War. So while it is still a Cold War, because the Soviet Union and America never actually fought each other, there was definitely still fighting happening, just by means of a third party. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is your summary of the Cold War. Now, like I said in the beginning, this doesn't go into very much detail, but more or less tells you the storyline of what's taking place. But if you have any questions, always feel free to comment down below. And because I'm on YouTube, I have to say, don't forget to like, don't forget to subscribe, and ring that notification bell. Thank you so much for watching. Good luck with any tests or exams coming your way, and I will see you next time. Ciao!